Welcome back to The Other 51. I'm Brian, and this week, very excited to have one of my favorite Broadway people joining me on the show again. She was on a few years ago to talk about her books, and she's got a new one out. Jennifer Ashley Tepper, welcome back to the show.
Thank you so much for having me back, Brian. I'm so excited to talk about the book.
I'm excited to hear all about it. But first, I do want to, there is something I do want to ask you about. So in your email signature, and I knew this had happened, but in your email signature, you dropped the Flex 2022 Tony Awards Honor for Excellence in Theater. That is
so
how first you're a theater kid. How cool was that? Is that to have that, and how cool was that whole thing?
It was very cool. So I've been the creative and programming director at 54 Below since 2013, so 11 proud years there, and we were so excited to get that Tony Award. I've programmed the venue for over a decade, so over 8,000 shows, and just being recognized as part of the theater community in that way was extremely cool. Got to go to some Tony Awards events, and that was awesome.
Nice. So you can kind of claim Tony winner. And you can claim Tony winner.
Tony Honoree.
Tony Honoree.
Yeah.
There you go.
For sure.
So your new book, I'm very excited to read it. It is out next month as we record this, and it is titled Women Writing Musicals: The Legacy That the History Books Left Out. There's a lot even to unpack even in that title, which is why I'm so happy to have you here. But to be done with it and to see it kind of going out in the world, I always like to ask writers this as their book comes out, because it's a long process, and we're going to get into that. But what is this moment like? Like just before it goes out, the work is done, you're starting to really get out there and talk about it. So what's this moment like for you as a writer?
It's so interesting because I always talk about how I wrote the majority of the book in 2020, like during deep COVID, during isolation, the highest isolation point of the pandemic. But sometimes I think back and I realize that I really started writing this in my brain earlier than that. There's so many women that I wrote about in the book that I, have been rereading recently to prepare for the book to be released. And I go, oh, wait, I became obsessed with that story, when I was writing Untold Stories of Broadway in 2013. Or, I told a story about this at 54 Below, 6 years ago. So it's been a long time in the making in my brain, but it's also been 4 years in the making in my, actual computer and Word documents and eventual book manuscripts. So I'm just so excited for people to finally read it. To get to finally share these stories with people is thrilling to me because so many of them are just like unheard Broadway stories that deserve to be told.
So let's go back to 2020. And I've seen your Instagram post about this, but where did the idea, it's one of those ideas that kind of of course it's a book to write, but where did this book, you get to this idea? So where did this idea come for you that this is my next book?
I've had so many wonderful teachers of Broadway history in college just by reading, by, becoming a theater historian by my own means. Like I've read so many wonderful books about theater history. And it's sort of wild that, in so many ways, there are women that are part of this narrative that wrote musicals, that wrote historic musicals, that aren't part of just the main timeline when we think about the development of the musical. And as I was writing my first books, The Untold Stories of Broadway, and just through my travels as a theater historian, a lot of the time I've gone, oh, why don't we know the story of, the first woman that did this, or the woman that wrote this musical, or, and so much of it is, it's pretty complicated and nuanced, and I write about it in the book, but because of the opportunities that women, had to work really hard to get over the years, and because of the ways that women were kind of accepted or not accepted in different eras in musical theater, their presence wasn't as consistent as men. It was a lot of oh, a woman had this one hit show, but then it didn't get licensed, or she didn't have another hit show. It's a lot of kind of choppiness in terms of people that were making history, but they still were making history. And it's also interesting because, of course, this isn't exclusive to women. In the world of musical theater, we all know this. There are beloved shows that close quickly. There are musicals that a couple people, love, but everyone else, doesn't know. And so just being able to kind of shout out a lot of the stories that are about shows that, someone might discover and it could be their favorite musical, but it's not the big hit of the season. It's not the landmark musical. I think is so important. It just shows people the diversity of work that's out there and that you can get excited about.
Was there a moment that you kind of, as you were thinking about writing this book, where you kind of had okay, this is it. This is when I'm going to do the book. This is when I'm going to actually start researching it and writing it. Do you remember a moment like that?
Definitely. I think the trauma of the pandemic year, it definitely has married itself to me writing this book in my head. There were so many days when I truly would like take a walk, wipe off my groceries with Lysol wipes, and then like write about a few women from the 1930s that were writing musicals. So I do remember, it was like April or May around that time of 2020, and a lot of people were talking about, hey, as artists, as people who are dealing with this moment where we're all locked in and we can't make anything with other human beings, like what's that thing you always wanted to do, whether it's like watch every movie on the AMC 100 movie list, or write a book, or write a symphony. There was this, and then there was like, oh my God, stop being so hard on yourself, like this is a traumatic time, take a nap or whatever. But that did start making me ruminate on it. And it definitely was a time where it's like, I wasn't working, I wasn't, running around seeing shows, I wasn't socializing. It was, we were all in our homes. And so I did start thinking, like, what's the book that I would write if I had time? And what's really funny, I don't know if I've told this to anyone else actually on, publicly, but I actually wrote like 4 books during COVID,
Oh,
not
wow.
just women writing musicals. And the other book, one of them was The Untold Stories of Broadway Volume 4. But I also was like, what if I wrote, a book of comedic essays? I'd always thought maybe I could do that. And I also thought, what if I wrote a historic fiction novel? The historic fiction novel is horrible. It will never see the light of day. And I learned from that. I learned like, I love reading historic fiction, but like, I can't write it, or I would need to take some other steps in order to write it. But it was an exercise, and it was like a really helpful exercise for my brain and as a writer. And just like, what if, it's like, what if I tried this? Anything that you might want to do, and giving it a shot. And then the comedic essays one, I think, is actually pretty great. And maybe someday I'll do that, but like probably not. But again, it was just like, it was that thing of, remember when we created things not for a goal, but just for excitement and fun. But as soon as I started working on women writing musicals, I was like, oh, this is something. And I think that I am uniquely qualified to write it based on how many of these women I've gotten to work with, interview, interact with, how many of these shows I've been fascinated with over the years. A lot of what sparked me was, oh my God, look at all these musicals that never got cast recordings. So this woman wrote this fascinating show. And again, this isn't exclusive to women. This is like the history of musical theater is like, if the show wasn't recorded, the tree fell in the forest and nobody ever heard it,
Mm-hmm.
And so, but it was, who are these women who, overcame certain barriers during their eras in order to create musicals? Who are these women who, made history in their time in art? Remember, who are the women who didn't make history, who like technically had short-lived shows, but that are really fascinating and worth exploring? And I became really obsessed with writing and tackling it decade by decade. And, sitting in my apartment again, like, the world was very scary during that era of the pandemic, and going, okay, like what did women overcome to make art during all these other times in history? And it really is not a direct parallel, but I did think a lot about like, oh, like the social justice movements of the 60s, like what were women writing about? And during World War II, when, women had certain jobs in the workforce that they weren't societally accepted into before, like how did that affect the musicals that were happening that they were writing? And so it did connect me to other times in history when people overcame adversity in order to create art.
So you get this idea, and please tell me you took naps during the pandemic. My God, that was workload.
I'm not good at naps.
So you came up and you've posted this, that you have a list of more than 300 women that you write about and profile in the book. So after you come up with the idea, did you come up with that list and then start researching them? Did you start researching and come up with the list? Like, kind of walk me through, like, you got this idea and you're excited about it, and then the now what?
Yeah, I think that as a creative person, at least for me, restrictions are helpful because they kind of give you something to work with. It is that thing of being like, okay, we're locked in our apartments. This is how much time I have. Like that's kind of helpful. And in a sort of silly, similar way, like nobody loves the library more than me. Nobody loves the New York Public Library more than me. Nobody loves the Library of Congress more than me. But in some way, it was helpful to know, oh, I could only use their online resources.
Hmm.
And so immediately when I started wanting to write this book, I came every newspaper archive, like with a significant online presence, even like the simplest newspapers.com or the New York Times archive, but like which newspaper archives could I really mine for this information? Which books do I already have at home? Which books can I order? I did so much reading. Like the source list for this book is over 500,
Oh my gosh.
items long because I really wanted to read so much just to understand how to chronicle these stories. Because there are over 300 women in the book, and some women, it's like, here's the one paragraph about their presence. And I think it's so important that their name is in the book and we say this is what they did. But if you're gonna, give a person just a short amount of time, you want to make sure that that is highlights, really their most important contributions. So I read a lot, listened to a lot. A lot of the women in the earliest chapters of the book were writing before there were cast recordings as we know them today. So I dug into, whatever sheet music history, lots of online resources. And then of course, once things started opening up a little bit more, I was able to go and do more research in person. But the first thing was a big deep dive into research. And then one of my favorite things about writing the untold stories of Broadway books that I've written is I do love that with those, people can open them and go, oh, I'm interested in reading about the Richard Rodgers Theater. Like, let me
Mhm.
just open to that chapter and see what, I'm going to see Hamilton. So I want to know what was happening in that theater. Or someone can go, oh, I love Danny Burstein. Let's just read his stories. And you can kind of bop around and it's sort of, or you can read the book, in chronological order and really go deep. But I do love that about it. And when I was writing Women Writing Musicals, the writing process was sort of similar. I would go like, oh, like, I feel like listening to music of the 40s today. Like, I'm going to work on the women in the 40s. Or I would go, like, oh, I saw something interesting about Gretchen Cryer and Nancy Ford and, their history as like the long running female songwriting team. Today, I'm going to tackle that section. So I bopped around. I definitely didn't write the book in order. And that was really nice to kind of give myself the ability to kind of transport into other times when we
Mhm.
were not always wanting to be in 2020.
And I'm wondering about the research too. And I've seen your videos. I'd say your TikToks, but I see them on Instagram a week later because I'm in my 40s. So
Me,
I
same. I totally get it. I always see TikToks on Instagram.
so
Yeah.
and as so you've been telling some of the stories of some of the women in your book, and it came to the realization that it had to be both kind of inspirational and kind of horrific to read these stories at the same time, right?
It really drives home the point. And again, like I know I've said this multiple times in our conversation so far, but it's like a lot of the struggles that women have gone through in the workforce are specific to women. A lot of the struggles that women have gone through in the theater workforce are specific to women, but some of them are just specific to musical theater writing. And a lot of it is like it is extremely hard to get a musical produced. I won't say it's extremely hard to get a musical written. It's challenging. It's hard, difficult to become, someone who writes great musicals, of course. But the challenging thing is getting it produced, is getting it on a stage and all that that entails. And so, yeah, it was definitely depressing to be like, oh, here's this fascinating female writer. Wow, her story's worth telling. Wow, that's a really cool accomplishment she made. Wow, she never got to have that happen again. It did. It was frustrating. And, you can always go, oh, because she was writing in the 50s and maybe if it was today, it would be easier. But one of the most fascinating things about writing this as a whole and the continuum is you are able to draw the parallels. You're able to go like, oh, this woman wrote about this issue in the 70s and this is the same issue being tackled in the 90s. Or, oh, this is like a woman who was asked in interviews this question in this decade and in this decade. And so I really wanted to focus on writing the book on, the work itself. I didn't want to make every single line of the book like this happened because this person was a woman.
Hmm.
It's about just like, telling their stories separate from the fact that they happen to all be women because honestly, like they differ in so many other ways. It's just interesting to look at it, as here's all of these women's stories and then also here's all these individual stories. But it was definitely like, oh, musical theater writing is hard was something I thought on every page, which I think often in my work as a theater professional because yeah, it is damn hard, but also like it's the miracle of musical theater that when something is, happening and it's touching people and it's exciting and great, it's the best thing in the world. And I do think like I was able to remind myself of some of the positives. By some of the women I wrote about, I was like, oh my God, people have to know this story. And it is my absolute dream with the book that someone might read my book or read a part of my book and go, oh wow, that musical sounds interesting, or that writer sounds interesting, or that song sounds interesting. I'm going to check it out. And then, they sing that song in a concert, or they do that musical at their school, or
Mm-hmm.
they just know about that woman and talk about her, because a lot of these shows deserve to be done more than they are. And I think the most well liked and most popular shows that are done regionally, licensing wise, I don't wish to take anything away from that, but I do feel like we could diversify the
Mm-hmm.
palette of what's licensed. And the licensing companies themselves are so great with that. You look on one of the websites and it's not that you can just license these 7 shows that we see every high school doing this year. There's really a large amount of shows, and I know some of it's about attracting an audience, but I think about some of the writers in this book with like incredible work that schools would love to do if they knew about it. And I just go, okay, I can be part of putting that word out there.
Yeah, we were talking about that before we officially started recording. There's a bunch of theaters around where I live where it's doing Hadestown, and that's great that it's out there. But then I think about, and this is kind of getting a feel about a show like Ride the Cyclone, which didn't have a lot of professional big life. I don't know if you know if it was on Broadway,
Yeah, yeah.
but it's like this total cult hit among youth theaters and among high schools. And yeah, that opportunity kind of opens up for different shows and older shows to get up. I'm not going to put you on the spot and say what's your favorite story from the book, because I know you probably love them all. But if you had like, what's one today that you would think of as like, oh, I need people to know about this, or like this, if someone were to ask you today, like me, like, what's a story from the book that really jumped out at you, spoke to you, kind of gave you, for good or for bad? What's one that you can that stands out for you today?
Yeah, so I was talking about this yesterday, which is probably why it's in my mind, because it's exactly what you said. Like, I'll say my story, my favorite story is a different story each day. But Tony Tennille of Captain and Tennille actually wrote a Broadway musical, and it was an environmental protest musical called Mother Earth. And I saw a show at the Belasco, maybe Happy Ending, the other night. So this is why I was talking about it, because that's where Mother Earth played. It was produced by Roger Ailes, who is not known for producing Broadway musicals. And it's like in the journey of the show is how Tony Tennille met Daryl Dragon. Like the way that sometimes these folks that are well known, for other reasons end up on Broadway or having like a Broadway show as a footnote in their career is always fascinating to me. And this show, I mean, there's like a publicity photo where all of these young people that were starring in Mother Earth are riding bicycles with gas masks on. And some of the reviews were like, well, what is the show for anyway? Like, who wouldn't want to save the environment? And you look at that and you're like, oh, haha, here we are 50 years later. There's lots of people that don't want to. So it's just interesting to look at these fascinating kinds of, underappreciated musicals and in hindsight and go, oh, wow. But that is one of the many musicals in the book that does not have a cast recording. And so whenever I get to dig it farther into that, I'm just fascinated by those. But I really, one of the things also is each chapter in the book chronicles one specific decade. So, it goes through to the 2010s, but it starts all the way back in the beginning of, when Manhattan was being settled by colonialists. And it's the bulk of the book, of course, is like the 20th century and then a bit of the 21st. But I did try to write about some women who were writing musical entertainments prior to that. And what's so funny is like when I posted my list of women in the book and the description, it starts in the 1700s. People were like, wait, what? And, it's kind of a well-known fact among theater aficionados and nerds and scholars that musical theater, as we know it, the musical got invented with the Black Crook, which is in, the mid to late 1800s was when musicals started happening. But even though they might not be considered musicals as we think of them today, I started like finding just in my research these women that were writing shows for the stage that had songs in them in the 1700s. And I think that first chapter of the book that's like pre-1900 is it's not the best chapter in the book because there's barely anyone to write about. But when I started finding a few women that did that, I had to include them. And it really made me fascinated by like just that really early American theater history. I know so much about the theater district. I can wander around Times Square and I know every single thing that played every theater in every block, but it really made me excited to like go downtown to like the lower tip of Manhattan where theaters first started getting built and go, oh, like what women were part of this history. So that was really exciting to me, even though it's the least deep part of the book because there wasn't a lot to write about, but it did spark something in my brain that made me want to learn more.
So the kind of after colon part of the title is the legacy that the history books left out. And I know this is a big theme of yours with your work, the untold stories of Broadway. And I just think that it's an interesting way. It's such an interesting way I feel like to frame this book, the legacy that the history books left out, because obviously there's a level of intentionality in that statement, whether it's, deliberate intentionality or how, or maybe you can kind of riff on that a little bit. So when you say the history books left out, like what does that mean to you?
Yeah. So there are plenty of women who are quote unquote in the history books. And by history books, I mean like the literal books, but I also just mean like the syllabi for history classes and, the licensing rosters and what musicals ended up in streaming and which ones got left behind in a past form of media. And it's just like, how do we perpetuate some of these shows and not others and why? And so, there's women like the great Lynn Ahrens, who's like one of the greatest lyricists of our time. Of course, like her musicals with Stephen Flaherty are included in quote unquote the history books. Of course, like Betty Comden and Green, the longest running musical theater team in writing history. Like there are these women that, of course, when you look at like, the general history of musical theater, they do rate in it. But then there are other women, one of the ones that I talk about a lot because I feel like it's so important that we know about her is Mickey Grant. And Mickey Grant was the first woman to ever write book and music and lyrics for a Broadway musical. And she starred in it. And it ran for over 1,000 performances. And people hear that and they're like, wait, why don't I know about her?
Right.
And the show was about the Black experience. She was not only a woman who was breaking all of these barriers in the 70s, she was a Black woman who, when you look at her section of the book, it's like, oh, she was the first woman to do this. She was the first Black woman to do this. She was the first woman writer to do this. And you're like, well, it's not just that we should note that she's the first person to do it. It's like how incredible, even if, thank God she was the first, but like, even if she was the fifth, that's pretty amazing. She's someone who I became really fascinated by and wanted to learn about all of her shows. And she did have, many, many more shows other than that one. And she lived like a long and prolific life. And for I think multiple reasons, and this is the nuanced part that you can kind of dig into. Her work and her songs aren't as remembered as maybe they might be. And I think, some of it is I was fascinated by this, which is that her show that I referred to that, she wrote book, music, and lyrics and starred and ran for a very long time on Broadway, Don't Bother Me, I Can't Cope, came out on LP. And then in the era where, people did not have record players anymore and it became cassettes and then CDs and then streaming, it did not make the transfer of
Oh,
media. And
interesting.
whenever a cast recording goes out of print or doesn't get transferred to new media, there's like a huge gap in the people who license it, the kids who know it, the people who get excited about that show, so they go see another show by that writer. There's these crazy little like, it seems like a minor thing, but really, shows or plays or, anything going out of print contributes to this. And so I think also there's this thing that became fascinating to me while I was writing the book about how the experiences of underrepresented communities tend to change more. So by that I mean, the experience of being a woman in 2024 in a lot of ways is different from the experience of being a woman in 1965. And the experience of being, a white cisgender man in society might not be as different. And so in that way, work that addresses women during a past era might be seen as dated. It's one of my favorite plays is the Heidi Chronicles by Wendy Wasserstein. And at the time, it was a very feminist, very forward thinking show, and now it seems dated again because the experience of that group changes, and so sometimes the writers who are writing it, their shows don't get produced as often. We don't see four men sitting around playing poker in a Shaw play and think like, oh, men don't do that anymore. They do. And yet something that was written about an experience of an underrepresented group a number of decades ago might now be seen as like, well, we don't, that's not how it is anymore. And so it's interesting. Like I just read a book about gays on Broadway. That's what it's called, by Ethan Morden. And he talks a lot about like Boys in the Band and, groundbreaking LGBTQ plays. And, I think it's so great when something like that can get revived and we go, okay, well, this is set in this era because it's different now. But I think we have to be able to look at these shows as from their era and appreciate that and go, oh, here's a woman writing from her perspective in 1931 or 1981. And that's okay that it talks about that experience differently, because if we don't do that, then we only get plays by, the same kind of people over and over. So that was something that as I wrote the book, like that happened over and over again. Gretchen Cryer and Nancy Ford wrote like so many incredible musicals that not that they were all about women or feminism, but they reflected their perspective during a certain era and they were women writing from their perspective. So it's just a matter of sometimes being able to be excited about a show that is not directly like, it's not 2024. We're not talking about TikTok. We're not, like, how does something from another era relate to us, even if it's not literally us at the moment?
I hadn't thought about the cast recording thing just in general. Like the shows that don't get cast recordings don't last. But then you didn't even think of, oh yeah, when they went to tapes, not everything went to tapes or CDs, and then that's that's such an interesting kind of unintentional gatekeeping situation, isn't it?
It exactly like you described it perfectly. It boggles my mind. And it's something that, again, like it was driven home to me writing the book, but I always knew about that because as someone who grew up as a theater nerd, like so many of us, do, when I was collecting cast recordings, when I was learning shows, I, would go, okay, well, here's these 5 shows I'm buying at the time, like Borders or Barnes and Noble or even Amazon. And if something was out of print, it was like it didn't exist. And especially if something wasn't recorded, it's like it didn't exist. So it's every like part of this process affects whether a show and whether a writer is remembered.
So, if kind of a related question, but if these are women that kind of haven't been in the history books, how much of a challenge was it to find material about them?
That's a good question too, because it is, I guess it's a bit of a contradiction. Certainly there is information about these women. A lot of my sources though were newspapers. A lot of it was looking back on, and it speaks to the question I just answered where like sometimes something would be written about these women that was meant to be complimentary but was very like misogynist or could be misconstrued. And I wanted to include that anyway. Like how these women were written about at the time that they were writing is part of the story. And like I think it's so important as we study these things to not go, oh, well, that might be offensive by today's terms. We can't include it. Like we need to examine it in order to like eradicate it or in order to like have a conversation. So a lot of it was newspaper resources and a lot of it was books. There are like very wonderful books that tell these untold stories other than mine. And it was really exciting to find those, to go into like these specialized musical theater books that aren't like the Broadway musical, and that's the book, but to go into like, there's some great ones. There's this wonderful book by Elizabeth Wallman that I read, cover to cover. There are some great books that like the ones that I strive to write cover these corners of musical theater history, like, how musicals, evolved in the 70s, like how musicals have aligned with social justice. Like it was exciting to kind of go into these specific musical theater scholarly topics and dig for information for the book in those. But also, in the earlier chapters of the book, there was a lot to go into with newspapers, especially again, like before these musicals were recorded at all. But when musical theater and Broadway were so in the public eye, there was a lot written about these women that was fascinating from, the most unknown newspaper to the New York Times that I read.
So I'll start wrapping up with this. And two questions I ask my Broadway people. One I ask everybody, but a question I always ask when I have Broadway people. What's the best show you've seen lately?
Oh, great question. I was obsessed with Yellowface. I thought that show was incredible. It blew me away. Love everything about David Henry Hwang's play and Daniel Day Kim's performance. And it also kind of relates to some of the stuff we're talking about today with the book, because it's a story that is about identity and it's also about creating and it's nuanced. Like that's, I think one of the things I love so much about this play is like it addresses like all of these things that occur because of like inherent racism, because of like the difficulties of creating theater, but it does so in this way that you're like, oh, it's not like one person on stage is right and one person is wrong. It's like how complicated it is to create in this insane world that we all live in. I'm specifically not giving away anything, like I'm doing that deliberately because I hate spoilers, but I really loved that play. I think it's so good. It's running at the Todd Hames on Broadway.
Nice. And my question to ask everybody, what's the best thing you've read lately?
Ooh, that's a great question. I have been reading so much this year. I currently have it my goal to read a bunch of books on the New York Times best 100 lists of the best 100 books of the century list that came out a couple weeks ago. What is the best book I've read recently? I've read so much. I read Men We Reaped by Jessamine Ward that was from the list, and that book floored me. It really it's a book about some like personal deaths from young Black men in her community that she's experienced. And it's like one of those books that's an incredibly personal memoir, but it's also like about a larger picture of social injustice in, you know, the Deep South and in America. And it's the kind of book where I don't know if I would have known about it if I hadn't been like, I want to read the top 100 books that the New York Times recommended on that list. So I've been excited to make my way through that list and read things that have been like highly rated that I might not know about otherwise.
Very nice. So we'll have links to all of that and tickets for that show in show notes and links to buy the book. So when does it come out officially?
It comes out November 19th.
Very nice. So we will have links for everyone to buy it and pick it up and learn about these awesome women. And next time, when the book of comedic essays comes out, we'll have you back on, or we'll just have you come on to talk Broadway at some point. Jennifer, this was awesome. Thanks for doing this again.
Thank you for having me. It's lovely to chat.
Thanks for listening to The Other 51. Thanks to Jennifer Ashley Tepper for being on this week. You can find links to buy her new book and all her books and everything else we talked about in our show notes. Jen Moritz does our graphics. Our theme music is by Ellie Moritz. I'm Brian, and I'll talk to you next time.